Hello everyone. 3 to 4 billion years ago, when Earth was still a young planet, life forms appeared in its primordial oceans. For almost 3 billion years, these life forms remained very small, made of a single cell for most of this period. But they multiplied, they diversified, and they slowly changed the chemical composition of the seas. And suddenly, about 540 million years ago, the number of marine species, their variety, and their sizes increased dramatically in an event called the Cambrian Explosion. All sorts of creatures, molluscs, fish, crustaceans, radiated and formed more and more complex food chains. From there, they would colonize the land and sometimes return to the sea. This is the journey I invite you to tonight. We're going to travel in time and discover how marine life evolved, how it appeared, or what we think we know of it, how groups of species rose to the top of their food chains and fell, or what happened when extinction events reshuffled the deck repeatedly. We will discover many extinct species of spectacular sea creatures. Some of them were the largest to ever live on Earth, from sea scorpions or giant armored fish to marine reptiles, as well as extinct life forms that would look really strange to us. So please adopt a comfortable position and get ready to explore hundreds of millions of years from the comfort of your seat or your bed. You can close your eyes at any time and still be able to follow the story. So don't hesitate to do it if you feel like it. And if you fall asleep, you can always return later. In the description box and the pinned comment under this video, you will find links to Patreon if you wish to support this channel and get the associated perks. You can contribute what you want from $1 a month, and also links to Spotify, Apple Music, and other audio streaming sites if you prefer to listen to my stories there. They all have dozens available, including an audio-only episode about the Great Library of Alexandria that is not on YouTube. Now, take a deep breath and think about the tension in your shoulders that you can gently release, because you really don't need it, as well as in the rest of your body, your neck, your arms, hands, legs and feet. We are ready to begin our exploration, and it starts 3.5 billion years ago, in the depth of Earth's ancient oceans. How and when did life begin in our planet's oceans? We just have theories about this, based on geological evidence and also the formation models of Earth and the solar system. Because the first question is how oceans appeared. Earth formed by accretion of space dust and asteroids, containing all the elements that are now inside it and at its surface, mostly iron, oxygen, hydrogen, silicon, or carbon. For a long time, it was thought that most of Earth's water came from other regions of the solar system and had been delivered later in its history via a bombardment of water-rich asteroids in the late stages of the formation process. Recent research tends to mitigate this view. It seems also that a lot of water could have appeared by a combination of hydrogen and oxygen that were already present directly on Earth. But the two ideas are not mutually exclusive. There is also evidence that at least some of that water was delivered to Earth by impacts from icy bodies. In any case, Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and it seems that around at least 4 billion years ago, give or take 100 million years, liquid oceans had appeared. Thanks to the planet's cool down and its atmospheric conditions that kept enough pressure for liquid water to not evaporate. Because these first oceans were probably quite hot at their surface, hundreds of degrees Fahrenheit. We know there were oceans at the time because samples of pillow basalt dated around 4 billion years ago were found around the world. And pillow basalt is a type of rock that forms during underwater volcanic eruptions, so its existence is good proof that there were oceans when this basalt formed 4 billion years ago. This is for oceans. But what about life? The earliest direct evidence of life has been discovered in sedimentary rocks from Greenland and has been dated to 3.7 billion years ago. What is this evidence? Stromatolites, which are layers of sediments created by mats of microorganisms, bacteria, microbes, that could live on chemical reactions using molecules that were present in these oceans, like sulfate, meaning they did not need light and photosynthesis to exist. Of course, these organisms are now fossilized, and these fossils indicate that life was present in water at least 3.7 billion years ago. Earlier than that, there is less conclusive evidence. All the layers of rock that were discovered in Canada or Australia could also be fossilized microorganisms, but their nature and their dating are more disputed. This date, when the first traces of life appeared on Earth, is not just an important debate for paleobiologists that study our planet. It is also relevant for astrobiology, the discipline that studies the hypothesis of life outside Earth. The planet is 4.5 billion years old, as we said. And if life appeared shortly after, it is an indication that in appropriate conditions, the appearance of life on a planet is likely or can be spontaneous. But if it took hundreds of millions of years, it could suggest that the process may be rarer and even may be exceptional. But what happened exactly? How did life appear out of the soup of molecules, of non-living chemicals that floated in the ocean? And at what point does a pack of molecules qualify as a life form? Biology and research on how life might have emerged define conditions for a life form to exist. And there are three of them. First, a living organism has to be able to replicate, to produce offspring that are very similar to itself. Second, it has to have metabolism. It must be able to feed and repair itself. And third, a living organism has an inside and an outside. There are cell membranes that allow food to enter, waste products to leave, and that exclude unwanted substances. An open question is, what was the starting point of life? Which of these conditions first appeared? It could be the appearance of RNA molecules, which are complex molecules that have the capacity to self-replicate, and so a form of life, or pre-life, that did not necessarily have metabolism or membranes that separate it from its environment, could have appeared. Just based on the replication of RNA molecules. Or the first phenomenon to emerge could have been metabolism. Chemistry indicates that given the right conditions of temperature and pressure, proteins can form from inorganic material like carbon monoxide and hydrogen sulfide, if they are in presence of the right catalysts, iron and sulfur. And these conditions were probably available in the depths of the Earth's oceans, near hydrothermal vents, these natural chimneys that eject heat and chemicals from the Earth's mantle. Or the first step could have been the appearance of membranes. Again, chemical conditions on the early Earth were appropriate for lipid molecules to form. And in water, these lipids tend to form bubbles with double walls that create an inside and an outside. This inside might have been the protected environment where other functions could appear. There is no definitive answer to this, but what we know is that around 4 billion years ago, these three functions, replication, metabolism, and separation from the environment by membranes, had come together in the first single-cell organisms. Another hypothesis for the appearance of life on Earth is called panspermia, the possibility that life arrived on Earth from space, or if not life, some of the basic components to it. It is true that some microorganisms have been proven able to survive the shock of being catapulted into space. So it is theoretically possible, with the intense bombardment of asteroids that happened on the early Earth. Maybe a few simple living organisms arrived like this. They found a suitable environment and multiplied on Earth. Now it doesn't tell us how life appeared originally. It displaces the question by making it come from another planet or another star system, maybe. So these various hypotheses, possibilities about the appearance of life directly on Earth or its arrival from somewhere else coexist at this point. None of them is proven, but they appear possible. What we know with more certainty is that at least 3.7 billion years ago, the first single-cell organisms lived and replicated in the oceans, probably in the dark. Photosynthesis, the use of sunlight as an energy source, had not appeared yet, and these life forms lived from chemical reactions based on the elements they found in water. They were bacteria and archaea, two different kinds of single-cell organisms. Around 3.5 billion years ago, a new form of life chemistry appeared with photosynthesis, the conversion of light energy, of sunlight, into chemical energy that can be later released to fuel the organism's activities. The waste product of photosynthesis is oxygen, and the multiplication of single-cell creatures living from photosynthesis had a dramatic impact on the composition of the oceans, because they became richer and richer in oxygen that these organisms ejected as a waste product of their feeding cycle. So their concentration in oxygen rose steadily for 1 billion years, until they became saturated, and oxygen began to escape to the atmosphere. This happened around 2.4 billion years ago. This phenomenon is called the Great Oxygenation Event, and it paved the way to life on Earth as we know it today, completely transforming the composition of the seas and the atmosphere that initially contained almost no free oxygen. You know that the evolution and classification of species is often represented as a kind of tree. Species branch out, their characteristics change slowly, and they diverge, giving birth to new branches, new organisms. But if there is an evolutionary tree, a phylogenetic tree, as it is called, this is the complicated word for it, and if you can follow its branches and diversification into all species that have existed, it means you can follow it up in reverse, looking for the first, the most ancient ancestor from which other organisms diverged. This primordial organism, a population that would be the ancestor of all known life, is called the Luca, L-U-C-A, for Last Universal Common Ancestor. It is not just a concept, it is a hypothesis based on the observation that all known life forms, ocean-bound or on land, from bacteria to the largest organisms, and including plants, fungi, or humans, carry a portion of their genome that is common, And it is believed that these common genes, this universal piece of information, comes from the last universal common ancestor. It is hypothesized that it was a single-cell organism that lived about 4 billion years ago in the high-temperature water of deep-sea vents near ocean floors. It is not necessarily the first life form ever on Earth, just the one ancestral to existing life. But maybe there were other experiments of nature that have disappeared or remain undiscovered. Marine life evolved apparently very slowly for hundreds of millions of years. From 4 billion years ago to 610 million years ago, fossil record indicates that life remained based on single-cell, microscopic organisms. Until something clicked, possibly a minor genetic change that allowed organisms to become made of multiple cells. And so the first viable, bigger life forms appeared in the seas, apparently independently. Organisms like sponges or brown algae. Sponges that have existed since then and still populate our seas are a weird kind of animal. They are similar to other animals in that they are multicellular. They start small and they grow. They feed on external resources, on bacteria, but they lack true tissues and they have no organs. They attach to an underwater structure and they remain in place, feeding on bacteria that float through their structure. And they use calcium carbonate or silicon dioxide in water to build a kind of flexible skeleton. Brown algae, which are another group with thousands of known species, are also a very ancient multi-cell life form. Some are attached to the seafloor and others float freely in mats, always near the surface because they live on photosynthesis. And like sponges, they have evolved since 600 million years ago, but their group has survived every single extinction event since then. These first multicellular organisms were just a taste of what was about to happen. Fossil record indicates that suddenly, over a relatively short period of time on a geological scale, 13 to 25 million years, the number of species, and especially larger species, rose considerably. And this happened around 540 million years ago. This sudden diversification has been called the Cambrian Explosion, or sometimes the biological Big Bang. In this relatively short period of time, the oceans became populated with larger, more varied, and more complex animals. Almost all present-day body plans of animals can be traced back to this period, the Cambrian Explosion. It was a period of intense experimentation by nature, if you want. So what did these new animals, bigger than anything before, look like? There was a wealth of small molluscs with shells. They were still tiny, around 1 to 2 millimeters, but they took a variety of shapes. Some look like snails, Others had the typical hard shells on their upper and lower surfaces, a bit like mussels. There were tubes, and sometimes we find elements in fossilized layer from the period that show us body parts with spines or armor plates, but we don't know how these parts were arranged. Apart from these small shells, there were bigger animals, including echinoderms. Echinoderms are better known as starfishes or urchins, but this group also includes other animals like sea cucumbers, and also the first trilobites that would populate the oceans for almost 300 million years. Trilobites ranged from a few millimeters to over 12 inches, 30 centimeters. And they are the earliest known form of arthropods. Arthropods represent one of two possible body organization for relatively large animals that have hard parts. You can be a vertebrate and have a skeleton with flesh and organs around it, like us, but also like fish, dinosaurs, or birds. Or you can have an exoskeleton that protects soft tissue and organs inside. Scorpions, crabs, centipedes, or butterflies are arthropods. They have this exoskeleton and a segmented body for movement. They are an extremely diverse group in seas and on land, which shows their adaptability. But their body plan comes with a limitation in terms of size. In order to keep growing, they need to go through stages of molting. That is to say, they have to shed their exoskeleton to reveal a new one, flexible at first, that allows them to grow. As we're going to see, arthropods had a strong start as predators in the oceans of the Cambrian and Ordovician periods. The Ordovician is the period that followed the Cambrian. Giant sea scorpions appeared that were at the top of the food chain, and we know them relatively well because their exoskeletons fossilized easily. So we have abundant evidence of their existence that lasted for dozens of millions of years. Trilobites evolved into many ecological niches. Some lived near the seabed as predators or scavengers. Others swam and fed filtering plankton, and some even crawled onto land as one of the species that began later to colonize this new environment out of the water. Ancient echinoderms like starfish, trilobites, or these different kinds of molluscs with shells kind of look familiar to us, because these animals are the ancestors of others that have retained their body plans. But it seems that in the intense experimentation or proliferation of life forms during the Cambrian explosion, many more organisms that would now look really strange also appeared. We know some of them thanks to well-preserved soft parts that were found in the Burgess Shale, the site in British Columbia, Canada, and after that in various other sites around the world that are dated from the Cambrian period. They reveal an ecosystem with the various families I just discussed, but also very weird-looking creatures that apparently did not make it to ulterior periods, like Opabinia, the name given to a soft-bodied animal with a slim and segmented body that carried flap-like appendages on each segment, 5 eyes, and a mouth that faced backward under the head. As if the various body parts we are familiar with in animals had been redistributed in a way that has no living equivalent today. Or another example is Odontogryphus, a flat and oval, soft-bodied animal that apparently had a single muscular foot and a kind of shell on its back. Yet another creature of the Cambrian, and one considered to be one of the first examples of an apex predator, a predator that has no predator, was an early arthropod called Anomalocaris, literally abnormal shrimp. It had a body length of about 40 centimeters, 1.3 foot. It doesn't sound like a lot, but with a size like that, in the oceans of the Cambrian, it was a gigantic organism. It propelled itself in the water by undulating flexible flaps on the sides of its body, and it had 2 flexible appendages on the front, presumably to catch prey and bring them to its mouth. It also had a pair of eyes, an evolution that existed in other arthropods, but Anomalocaris probably had the best eyes of its time. They were comparatively enormous, more than 1 inch, which probably gave it a huge advantage as a hunter in shallow waters. There was few fish yet. We'll talk about fish in a minute. And it is believed Anomalocaris preyed on other arthropods and molluscs. 488 million years ago, the Cambrian period ended. Like all the periods we will talk about, the end of a period and the beginning of another one was marked by an extinction event. This is how these different periods have been established. An extinction event, that is to say, a quick reduction in the number of species, especially the largest ones generally, revealed by fossil record. The following period is called Ordovician, and I'm not going to detail all periods one by one to our times, because there's a dozen, and despite extinctions between them, species disappeared, but classes of animals went on through these periods, under new forms, new species. The Ordovician deserves to be mentioned, though, because during it started when the Cambrian ended and lasted for 42 million years. During it, a second major radiation, a flourishment of life of the same magnitude as the Cambrian Explosion happened. It is during this period that the complexity of marine ecosystems deepened to the levels that have characterized marine life to our days. The number of genera, that is to say of groups of species, was multiplied by 4 during the Ordovician. Fish evolved from earlier forms and began to acquire jaws at the end of the period. Molluscs became bigger and more evolved, with cephalopods like Nautilus becoming large animals, and new predators appeared, like sea scorpions or a giant cephalopod shaped like a cone called Orthoceras. That's a lot of words. What does it all mean? Let's take things one by one. Fish are marine vertebrates. They have an inner skeleton, including a skull, that breathe underwater and lack limbs with digits. The earliest ancestors of fish, the first organisms that can be classified as such, appeared during the Cambrian. They lacked a true spine at first, but they had flexible rods called notochords, similar in structure to cartilage. The skeleton of modern fish is made of cartilage, but notochords are not as stiff. Even though notochords are not cartilage or bones, they gave them a structure and an agility that invertebrates didn't have. They could swim, accelerate, change depth, and later hunt better than other families of Cambrian animals. This characteristic allowed them to find a place and thrive in the late Cambrian and Ordovician, diversifying into a wide variety of forms. At the end of the Ordovician, or the beginning of the following period, the Silurian, they acquired jaws, and some of their representatives became formidable marine predators, rather than the prey of arthropods like sea scorpions. Fish predator can make us think about sharks, but the time of sharks had not arrived yet. They appeared also during the Ordovician, but were much smaller than they would become, and they fell somewhere in the middle of the food chain, preying on small animals and being prey to larger fish or arthropods. The majority of modern sharks can be traced back to about 100 million years ago, long after the Ordovician, during the Jurassic. And from there, they slowly moved up to the top of the food chain in the ocean, culminating rather recently, 23 to 4 million years ago, with the megalodon, a species of giant shark that is regarded as one of the largest and most powerful marine predators to have ever lived. It could have reached up to 66 feet, 20 meters, with an astonishing speed and bite force that left it with no equivalent at the time it lived. The modern great white shark is thought to be a relative, but the two diverged during the Cretaceous, so they are not part of the exact same family, even though the megalodon may have looked like a much bigger great white shark. We don't exactly know because the skeletons of sharks are not made of bones, but rather cartilage. They don't fossilize well, so there is no full fossil megalodon, only separate vertebrae, jaws and teeth, from which the characteristics of the animals are extrapolated. The age, the time of the megalodon was almost yesterday in geologic terms. It ended 4 million years ago. But if we return to the Ordovician, 450 million years ago, sharks were more modest, and before their time arrives, The first true fish apex predators would be a class of armored fish called placoderms. As they gained in size, these fish developed armored plates on their head and thorax during the Silurian 440 to 420 million years ago. They acquired very powerful jaws, and it seems an evolutionary race took place between bigger and bigger placoderms with more powerful jaws and their protective armor. By the end of their domination, 360 million years ago, many of the largest placoderms belonged to a genus, a group of species, called Dunkleosteus. These ones are relatively well known because their heads and armor plates fossilized very well. The largest species is estimated to have grown up to 29 feet in length, 9 meters, and 4 tons in weight. Their strength, and especially the bite force they had, suggest that they hunted other placoderms and they crushed their armored plates. Placoderms went extinct at the end of the Devonian 360 million years ago, after a reign of dozens of millions of years in the Earth's oceans. But the story of fish continued. Their diversity and their ability to adapt to different environments, sea or freshwater, different depths, this ensured their survival. Today, fish have more than 30,000 different described species, and there are probably many more at high depth, which makes them the most diverse of all groups of vertebrates. But returning again to the Ordovician, vertebrates were not the only ones to gain in size and strength. Molluscs and arthropods did too. A large group that flourished at the time was the nautiloids, which still exist but used to be much bigger and abundant than they are today. They are molluscs living and swimming in shells that can be of different shapes, coiled or sometimes straight, like cones. One of their representatives that dominated the seas long before the rise of armored fish was a genus called Orthoceras, straight horn, literally. It had a very long, straight shell, shaped like a cone, and they could be up to 11 meters long, more than 30 feet, and they used tentacles to catch prey. But all these are just a few examples of marine ecosystems that were probably already close to the diversity we know today. Many families flourished, including corals, starfishes, sponges, all sorts of mollusks, trilobites, and plenty of tiny crustaceans. I told you arthropods also participated in the size race. They did it in particular with eurypterids, also known as sea scorpions. These sea scorpions became a major component of marine fauna until 420 million years ago, before declining and disappearing 250 million years ago. But even though earlier species were only marine, later ones may have had a dual respiratory system that allowed them to venture on land for short periods of time. They had the broad morphology of a scorpion, but with different proportions Their pincers to manipulate food were not very big, and their bodies were sturdier. A size of 3.5 feet was common for them, even though there were much smaller ones, and also the largest known arthropod to have ever existed, a genus called Echelopterus. I told you before that arthropods were somewhat limited in size by their exoskeleton and the necessity to shed it to grow. Another limitation is their respiratory system, especially for land arthropods. They don't have lungs similar to vertebrates, and it is believed to be the reason why land arthropods never reached big sizes. They cannot breathe enough to sustain a large and compact body. The largest arthropods to have lived out of water were prehistoric dragonflies that could be much larger than modern insects, with a span of several feet. But that is still not huge compared to vertebrates, and it is believed the air was richer in oxygen at the time. These same species of dragonflies could no longer survive in our modern atmosphere. So the largest ever arthropod was a quadock, and it could reach around 8 feet, 2.5 meters. But it is uncertain it really lived in the sea. The layers in which Echelopterus fossils were found suggest that it could have lived in freshwater environments, maybe. Millions and millions of years passed, during which these various animals thrived and declined. After the Ordovician came the Silurian and the Devonian, sometimes called the Age of Fish, when armored fish dominated the seas. We just talked about it. On land, the first plants had begun to spread, and large parts of the continents now looked green. The following period, the Carboniferous, is when future reserves of coal and oil began to form. As for millions of years, this vegetation became trapped under layers of sediments, and the process of coalification began. The seas of the Carboniferous were still teeming with life, but some of the earliest groups of complex species, such as trilobites, were now declining, but fish were thriving. The age of placoderms, these sometimes very large armored fish, had ended, but sharks were multiplying, and fish species that we could find relatively familiar coexisted with extinct fish species that would look extremely weird to us. Fish like Acmonistian, a fish looking like a small shark, but with a large dorsal fin that looked a bit like an anvil of unknown function, or the coelacanth, bony fishes that are related to the ancestors of tetrapods. The tetrapods are the first amphibians that colonized the land. For a long time, coelacanths were thought to have disappeared in the late Cretaceous, 66 million years ago, until 1938, when living coelacanths were discovered off the coast of South Africa. And for that reason, it was called a living fossil, because following this discovery, scientists believed that they were the sole remaining member of a group that was thought to be extinct, and that they had remained unchanged for tens of millions of years. This view of the coelacanth was a bit exaggerated, because since then, other studies have revealed that coelacanth body shapes are much more diverse than thought. And yes, they have changed since the Cretaceous. But still, these fish appeared 400 million years ago, and their descendants still live in our oceans, looking almost the same. The 6 periods from the Cambrian, when the Cambrian Explosion took place, to the Carboniferous, and finally another period called Permian, are grouped together in a larger division of time, an era called the Paleozoic era. Literally, Paleozoic means ancient life. Why group these periods together, these 6 periods, into an era? Because at the end of it, at the end of the Permian, a particularly large and catastrophic extinction event took place, one that affected life much more than in between these periods. It did not fully reset marine life. Many of the different categories of animals that we have discussed made it to the following era, the Mesozoic, middle life, but the number of species dropped dramatically, and all their large representatives were wiped out. It took life millions of years to recover into this new era, the Mesozoic, and its first period, 250 to 200 million years ago, is called the Triassic. The rulers of the seas that emerged during this period would be quite different from the arthropods, molluscs or armored fish that had dominated during the Paleozoic. This new age saw the rise in size and strength of marine reptiles. I told you about them a bit more in detail in a recent story, The Night at the Museum, in which I commented on fossils of marine reptiles. So I invite you to check this other story to learn more or refresh your memory. But the apex predators and many other medium-sized species would now be reptiles that had transitioned back from land to sea and become adapted to full-time aquatic life, even though they kept breathing air. These groups include ichthyosaurs that looked like dolphins or fish, except they were reptiles, or sauropterygians, which over time came in a variety of sizes and shapes, including placodonts that developed armor on their backs that made them look a bit like turtles, even though they were not turtles, or plesiosaurs. Speaking of turtles, the Triassic is also when these particular reptiles appeared on Earth. Their main characteristic, the shell on their back that encloses all the vital organs of the turtle, is made of bone that develop from their ribs, and it is covered in scales made of keratin. Keratin is the material of hair, horns, or claws that many animals can grow, including us humans. As the Mesozoic advanced into a new period, the Jurassic, the time when dinosaurs dominated the land, marine life saw a few new innovations. They include the first modern crabs and also the earliest octopuses. We are now 200 million years ago, and these mollusks with 8 limbs first appeared living near the seafloor in shallow marine environments. Most of their body is soft tissue, and for that reason fossils are relatively rare. But enough were found to figure out their evolution history from the first mollusks of the Cambrian that branched out several times, giving birth to a large category called cephalopods. Cephalopods appeared 530 million years ago and are characterized by a symmetrical body, a prominent head, and a set of arms or tentacles. They also have a common ability to squirt ink to surprise or escape. The cephalopods split a few times into new families, like nautiloids, or the one that includes squids and cuttlefish. And finally, 155 million years ago, octopods, of which all octopuses are part of. Modern species have changed since the Jurassic, but they retain the same body characteristics, and they have been quite good at adapting to different depths and environments. Their sizes range from 1 inch to 14 feet for the largest modern species, the giant Pacific octopus, but exceptionally bigger sizes have been claimed for a few specimens, up to 30 feet. They don't really have much time to grow because their lifespan is relatively short. Once males have fertilized the female, they enter a process of senescence. That is to say, their cellular functions gradually stop without repair or replacement, which leads to death in a few weeks or months at most. And for females, it happens when they lay a clutch of eggs. They spend their last days caring for their eggs without feeding, and when the eggs hatch, they die. An exception is the Pacific striped octopus that can reproduce several times, but it still doesn't live more than 2 years. This short lifespan is probably a big limitation, because octopuses have been proven to be highly intelligent for invertebrates. They have a complex nervous system, which is only partially localized in their brains. 2/3 of their neurons are in their arms, and they have a high brain-to-body ratio. Intelligence does not depend just on the size of the brain, but in the case of octopuses, they have been observed to be good at problem solving, like finding and remembering the exit to a maze, or opening containers. And they have both short-term and long-term memory. They can train and learn in a way that is quite extraordinary in the animal realm. What limits them is their short life and the absence of transmission to the young. The female typically dies as the eggs are hatching, so every new generation has to start over, which excludes an accumulation of experience and knowledge like for humans. But who knows if in the next few million years, an evolution, like a mutation of their genome, gave octopuses a longer lifespan and the possibility to educate their young. There could theoretically be the emergence of a new species able to accumulate experience. But the interesting thing would be that most species that have shown intelligence are mammals, whereas octopuses have a very different architecture of their nervous system. After the Jurassic, the Mesozoic ended with a last period, the Cretaceous, that still saw marine ecosystems dominated by marine reptiles, except ichthyosaurs declined, and a group of new, sometimes very large predators emerged, mosasaurs. At the end of the Cretaceous and the Mesozoic happened again a major catastrophic extinction event, the one that wiped out dinosaurs. Not entirely, since it is believed that birds are a surviving branch, but all non-avian dinosaurs disappeared on land. And in the seas, all large species also went missing, putting an end to the age of marine reptiles. Again, not all of them. Sea turtles made it to the following period, the Paleogene, during which life slowly radiated again. But this time, the new masters of the seas would be sharks, we already talked about them, occupying the niches left vacant, and cetaceans, which also transitioned from land to sea, as marine reptiles had done 200 million years earlier. I also told you about the emergence of cetaceans in the seas in the previous story, The Night at the Museum, including the rise of whales and their diversification between hunting whales that today include dolphins, orcas or sperm whales, and filter-feeding whales like blue whales and other species of whales. They are still predators today, but somewhat more peaceful than their predecessors like Basilosaurus, which was the marine apex predator 40 to 34 million years ago. And finally, in the Neogene and Quaternary periods, the Quaternary is our period, marine life took its modern form after hundreds of millions of years of evolution, with the coexistence of very ancient organisms like sponges or simple molluscs, a huge variety of fish, or corals, and the thousands of species that emerged since, from octopods, crustaceans or turtles to cetaceans. A world of beauty, at the same time fragile, but extremely resilient and adaptable, as we have seen all along our journey. And buried under layers of sediments, this marine world includes the remains of thousands and thousands more species, large and small, that appeared, flourished for thousands of generations, and went extinct due to competition from others, or a change in their environment that they could not adapt to, or extinction events. All of these forms our modern oceans, a world we have learned about a lot in the past few decades, but that is still full of mystery, of unknown or undescribed species, of unfamiliar ecosystems, especially in the depths of the abyss, where pressure is enormous, and where there is no sunlight. This is the end of our exploration journey for for tonight. You can now let go and fall asleep. I'll be back soon with another story. And in the meantime, sleep well. Au revoir.